In ancient China, merchants were forbidden from wearing silk, forbidden from riding in carriages, and their sons were barred from the imperial examinations, even if they were wealthier than the officials above them. Scholars, farmers, artisans, merchants, they ranked last. Yet in the same era in Europe, merchants were building cities, financing kings, entering parliaments, and ultimately reshaping the entire power structure of the modern world. The same profession, buying and selling for profit, pushed to the bottom on one side, elevated to the top on the other. This was not cultural preference, not a difference between Confucianism and Christianity. Behind it was a colder logic, whether power could survive without you. In China, the question was never whether merchants could make money. The question was whether their money was useful. The traditional explanation says Confucianism looked down on merchants. They did not farm, did not craft. They merely bought low and sold high. That explanation is not wrong, but it is shallow. Officials did not farm or craft either, yet they ranked first. The real logic was not moral. It was structural. The fiscal foundation of the Chinese Empire was remarkably simple. Land tax. In theory, all land belonged to the emperor. Farmers worked the land and paid taxes. Grain flowed directly into the imperial treasury. This system had one critical feature. The emperor needed no middleman. He needed farmers to grow food. He needed officials to collect taxes. He needed soldiers to guard the borders. But for most of its history, the empire did not depend on merchants as a core resource. Commerce existed, but to the power structure it was secondary and controllable. Merchants had money, and money meant independence. No reliance on imperial salaries, no dependence on land, the ability to employ people, build networks, and expand influence. In a system where all power had to flow toward the center, that kind of independence was itself a risk. So dynasty after dynasty did not merely look down on merchants, they systematically constrained them. During the reign of Emperor Wu of the Han, merchants faced heavy taxes and restrictions on their economic activities. In the Ming and Qing dynasties, regulations governed what they could wear and how they could travel. The purpose of these measures was not morality, it was control, ensuring that wealth could never easily convert into power. In this system, you could have money, but you could not become important, simply because you had it. In Europe, the problem was the exact opposite. What they lacked was not power, it was money. Europe remained fragmented for centuries. Dozens of states crowded together, competing and fighting constantly. War required money, mercenaries, weapons, fleets. None of it came cheap. But European kings faced a problem that Chinese emperors did not. Their finances were not entirely their own. Land had been parceled out to nobles, and taxation often required negotiation and consent. This meant they could not simply take what they needed. When the money ran short, there was only one option: borrow. And the people who could lend were the merchants. That single act of borrowing changed everything. Merchants were willing to lend, but not for free. They demanded returns, trade privileges, legal protections, even the right to participate in political decisions. The earliest form of the English Parliament emerged precisely because the king had to let merchants and nobles into the decision-making process in exchange for their money. From there, urban self-governance, merchant guilds, and parliamentary systems gradually developed. The logic was simple. If you need my money, you must hear my voice. This was not a matter of who was more enlightened. It was a matter of who was more broke. And in the constant competition between European states, kings could not suppress merchants the way Chinese emperors did. If you refused to borrow, someone else would. If you suppressed your merchants, they would migrate to your rival. And so, step by step, merchants were elevated from lenders to indispensable pillars of state power. Two paths, but the same underlying structure: China, a unified empire with finances built on land, commerce as a supplement. Power did not depend on merchants, so merchants had no bargaining chips. Europe, dozens of competing states with insufficient revenue, forced to rely on commercial capital. Power could not function without merchants. So merchants gained leverage, the same profession, two entirely different fates. What determined their fate was not how much wealth they created. It was whether power needed them to exist. China's own history confirmed this pattern. During the Song Dynasty, commerce flourished as never before, and the status of merchants rose noticeably. The reason was no mystery. The Song was constantly paying tribute to the Liao, Jin, and Western Shah. The annual tribute to the Liao alone amounted to 100,000 taels of silver and 200,000 bolts of silk. The court had no choice but to rely on commercial tax revenue to fill the gap. When power began to need commerce, attitudes shifted. The pattern never changed. So back to the original question. Why did China suppress merchants while Europe elevated them? In one system, he was expendable. In the other, he was irreplaceable. All the moral judgments history has passed on merchants: greed, speculation, producing nothing of value, were often little more than surface rhetoric. What truly mattered was a deeper rule. The status of any class is never determined by how much value it creates. It is determined only by whether power cannot survive without it. That rule has never expired.